Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello, welcome. This is part 2 of a 3-part series on the institutional crisis in the United States and the very slow path from liberal democracy toward a version of authoritarianism. At the core of the issue of institutional legitimacy is the public perception of faith and confidence in the public sector and private sector institutions, especially in government, in the public sector, in other words, insofar as the public perceives that the government is faithful to executing the social contract, which is reflected in the Constitution of a country, in this case in the United States Constitution, drafted in the 18th century on the basis of the political philosophy primarily of the English thinker John Locke of the late 17th century, but also of French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was more in the vein of social democracy. The institutional legitimacy crisis in the United States is symptomatic of a deeper crisis, and that is the crisis of the neoliberal political economy. Neoliberalism has its genesis in the Jimmy Carter administration, but he did not formalize it. It was Ronald Reagan who formalized the neoliberal political economy based on deregulation, low taxes on the rich and corporations, corporate subsidies replacing social welfare subsidies, the corporate welfare state becoming the dominant entity in society, and the government essentially used as a tool to buttress Wall Street in the case of the United States, in other words, big capital, while withering away the social safety net in the case of the United States that was established, whose roots go back to the progressive era of the early 20th century, but really expanding during the New Deal when FDR institutionalized the economic policies of John Maynard Keynes, so Keynesian economics, which essentially was designed to extricate the United States from the Great Depression by strengthening the working class and the middle class, that is, providing some spending power, raising consumption, and raising taxes on the wealthy rather than lowering, which is exactly what the neoliberal model does. Institutional legitimacy crisis in the United States is ubiquitous. It's not in one sector. It's not the domain of the GOP, the Republican Party, or one person, Donald Trump. These people are actually, they're symptoms of a larger systemic crisis in the United States, because you see that crisis in public opinion polls, that the public has lost confidence in every institution. At the end of the session, I will mention very briefly some statistics of the latest public opinion poll of how the public has in fact lost confidence in the institutional structure, in everything from media to Congress, even religious institutions. So this is a ubiquitous crisis. It's an overall crisis. Today's session, part 2, the first part, by the way, I should parenthetically mention, really focused on the election of a young man in New York City Zoran Mamdani, who is a progressive, although, in other words, in the same vein as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, a few others in Congress, meaning a New Deal Democrat, although the mainstream media, political opponents, and including establishment Democrats, by the way, have tried to portray Mamdani as communist, socialist, some aberration of the mainstream, when in fact he very much fits into the mold of a Keynesian Democrat. That is a New Deal Democrat. And we've had those, in 1972, Senator George McGovern ran for president against Nixon. We had those. Bernie Sanders is the latest, who ran in 2016. That was his best showing. And we have seen those, a few of those in Congress, and even some establishment middle class Democrats, go along with some of the progressive policies, which they realize are necessary to keep the popular base of the Democratic Party, which has been historically, since FDR, the working class and the middle class. Now, today's session is on the criminal justice system, the judiciary, the Department of Justice, and one would need an entire book to explain what has happened in the last 6 months with regard to the issue of the issue of the institutional crisis in the criminal justice system, considering that the executive branch, namely the presidency, and the agencies of the president, including the Department of Justice, by the way, have been defiant of the judiciary, and openly so in congressional testimony, both in the House and in the Senate, when various administration officials have come up for testimony before committees of the House and the Senate to explain why they have ignored orders of judges. They simply cite the right of the president to pursue his policies. In other words, they invoke what we call unitary executive theory, which is at the core of authoritarianism, the road to authoritarianism, I should say. It is at the core of authoritarian, what some scholars, by the way, call authoritarian constitutionalism and authoritarian institutionalism. So this is, I don't mean for the semantics to get in the way of this, but this simply means that behind the facade of liberal democracy, the policies and the practices of the state are not based on division and separation of powers. They're not based on respect of civil society. They're not based on consent. They're not based on social justice. They are based on the whims of the executive. Perhaps the word whims is too strong. They are based on the will of the executive branch of government, and to the detriment of the other two branches of government, namely the legislative and the judiciary, given that the Constitution of the United States, the founding fathers, set up a government of balances, a government of separating these powers, so that no branch, especially the executive, by the way, has too much power, because the founding fathers lived during the 18th century. They lived during the era of absolute monarchy. So they were very much concerned about America having something like an absolute monarchist in the face of the president. Yet the fact is that we now have unitary executive theory, that is the concentration of power at the executive branch, weakening and creating, weakening the other two branches of government, the legislative and the judiciary, and making them much more docile, in some cases blatantly ignoring the mandate, the legislative mandate, the mandate of Congress to fund, for example, agencies, and for those agencies to be carrying out the mandate of Congress rather than carrying out executive orders from the White House. And of course, they do the same thing with the courts. They ignore the courts, they challenge the courts, and it just so happens that they have on their side, the GOP has on its side the majority of justices in the Supreme Court, and that has helped them institutionalize a unitary executive theory. And we see that in authoritarian constitutionalism and authoritarian institutionalism, which really is behind the thin layer of liberal democracy, behind the hollow rhetoric of liberal democracy. There is really a state structure that resembles authoritarianism. Now, let me give you some statistics. The President George W. Bush, in 8 years in office, signed 291 executive orders. President Obama signed 276. President Trump signed 220 in just the first term, and an astonishing 171 executive orders in 6 months. So when you look at the statistics of executive orders from Bush to Obama to Trump, and Biden is in here. Biden was at 276. When you look at the statistics, it's alarming how many executive orders Trump has signed in the last 6 months. Why would a president sign that many executive orders? And it's not just this is not a quantitative issue, it's a qualitative issue. What is the nature of the executive orders that the president is signing? If the nature of the executive orders is to achieve greater social justice in society, greater freedom and equality for all, okay? If it is to abide by the Constitution, to abide by the laws of the land, rather than to circumvent them, because that's what an executive order is. You bypass, you circumvent Congress, and you go directly, you sign an executive order, the president signs an executive order circumventing the legislative branch. Toward what end? Everything from weakening the US labor movement to weakening the social safety net, social welfare state that's been around since the FDR era of the 1930s during the Great Depression. And there was a reason for that, by the way. Lord Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, was a brilliant economist. He envisioned a state structure that would save capitalism, not destroy capitalism. Keynes was not a Marxist, by the way. He saved capitalism. But to do that, you need a strong middle class. To have a strong middle class, you need a strong working class. And those two, by the way, are intertwined with a strong democracy. A strong middle class and a strong working class is necessary for a good functioning democracy. When you have executive orders that wither away at those privileges of those, let's call them privileges, if you will, and you then transfer privileges to the 1% richest Americans who own more than 90% of the wealth of the entire country, then there are all sorts of socioeconomic and political polarization consequences for society. That's when we get to authoritarian constitutionalism and authoritarian institutionalism, and the crisis that we have today in the entire criminal justice system, which has vilified migrants and the working class, because an integral component of the neoliberal political economy is class warfare. This is not just me as a critic of neoliberalism. Warren Buffett, who is a billionaire, one of the richest men in the world, agrees that it is the capitalist class that is, through the state, by the way, carrying out the wishes of the capitalist class, declaring war on the working class. And there is an angle here of culture wars within class wars, and that is, the angle is focus on undocumented immigrants. So the migrant question, which in the Western world, it's not just the United States, but the entire Western world is obsessed with the migrant question. Although when you look at the deeper, when you have a scholarly approach, by the way, in other words, you have to, this means one has to go and study. When you study the deeper causes of why are there people leaving their land where they were born, the land they love, the people that their loved ones, and migrate to foreign land, why would they do that? They're either persecuted politically, or they have economic problems, or there's war there. So when you look at and then when you look at what are the deeper causes of war in the global South, or endemic poverty and inequality in Latin America, when you look at the deeper causes, you're right back to the world capitalist system and the core countries where most of the wealth is concentrated, linked to the global South, where labor values are very low, so people migrate. They migrate. Now, if it is a crime, and we'll get more into that with the issue of migrants in America, if it is a crime to go seek a better life by working, by the way, if that's criminalized, there is something wrong with the entire social contract. But the social contract does not criminalize labor, of course, doesn't criminalize. It is obviously against the law to enter a country without the proper documents. It is not against the law, as this has come up, by the way, in various venues in congressional testimony. In other words, elected officials have brought this up. It is not against the law for people to seek to go into another country to seek asylum, to as economic refugees or political refugees, or running away from war or terror that they're facing in their own country. Now, the question of the crisis of the criminal justice system is that the criminal justice system in America has focused on the working class and migrants who are also working class. So it's the combination of class warfare and culture wars. And that appeals to the populist right-wing base. But the establishment Democrats, in other words, Biden in the 4 years before Trump, did not do much to address this issue so that we would not be in the mess we are today in the United States, with Homeland Security having a budget that's larger than every defense budget of every country in the world except US and China. In other words, the Homeland Security is really a super agency, if you will. And although its beginnings were modest, it was and very focused. It was to fight terrorism after 9/11. It was not to go after Mexicans and Guatemalans in Los Angeles, who in women cleaning hotel rooms and yanking children, school children, out and separating from their parents and going out to the onion fields and picking up farm workers. This is not to say, by the way, that the law should not be respected. The law should be respected, but the question is, what are the policy measures that are adopted in a democratic and an open society? This is what the issue is here. This is about process, and this has come up repeatedly in Senate hearings and House hearings. The issue is due process, okay? Now, for the past 50 years, in other words, from Reagan to the present, 45 years, what we have is that both parties have contributed. It's not, I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that the responsibility for the crisis of neoliberalism and for the crisis in institutional legitimacy rests on the shoulders of the Republican Party. It does not. I have been very clear, in fact, in my writings as well as in videos, I have argued that actually Democrats have more responsibility. They're supposedly, in theory, the party of the working class and the middle class. The Republicans, the party of the Rockefeller wealthy class. The Democrats have been, from Bill Clinton, who succeeded George Herbert Walker Bush, the vice president under Ronald Reagan, also following neoliberal policies, all the way to Biden, or every Democrat president, Obama included, by the way, especially Obama, was a neoliberal, Cold War militarist president. They have contributed to the socioeconomic polarization reflected in political polarization. The institutional crisis is not on the shoulders of the Republican Party. It's on the shoulders of both political parties, both of them. So this is not to single out President Trump or the Republicans, because everyone has a share of the responsibility here. That's just the reality. Now, the fact is, however, that the Republicans have moved more aggressively, especially, and I gave you the statistics of Trump's executive theories. He has signed more executive orders, not theories, executive orders. He has signed more executive orders than any president in the history of the United States, from Andrew Jackson to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, of course, it can be excused because it was a Civil War situation. But Andrew Jackson, and him, who tried to create an imperial presidency, to the present. So this barrage of executive orders to strengthen, based on the unitary executive theory of a strong executive, weak legislative, weak judiciary, make them as docile as possible. Now, just like the Supreme Court, just follow along whatever the Republican president is signing, and go along with it. It doesn't matter what the Constitution stipulates, or it doesn't, no matter what the founding fathers had in mind about the separation of powers and balance of power, the separation of branches in government and the balance of power in government, and the fear of the sort of thing that's exactly happening today. They feared then, that not that they could foresee what would happen today, but they they judged everything from their contemporary perspective, which was back then, it was absolutism under monarchies. And they didn't want some version of that coming up in the future. And yet here it is happening. Dismantling civil society and attacking pluralism and diluting the role of the judiciary and the legislative branch of government is really indicative of a crisis in the constitutional system and in the institutional structure. It is a crisis of democracy. And the reason this is important is because the United States promotes itself as the greatest democracy in the world. I haven't heard Japan say, we're the greatest democracy in the world. I haven't heard Norway, which, by the way, in my view, is the greatest democracy in the world, say we're the greatest democracy in the world. Or Sweden. It's the US. And yet, the metrics and based on the policies, the empirical evidence, we have to follow the empirical evidence, not the rhetoric. This is a society now on the slippery slope to authoritarianism. And the criminal justice system, and as I mentioned today, is in fact molded on the basis of the authoritarian model. Everything from the migrant question to attacking educational institutions, especially higher education, using money given to education, including, by the way, dismantling the Department of Education. Here are the Chinese, right, pouring massive amounts of money in education and strengthening centralized education. The US just dismantled the Department of Education, and the Supreme Court went along with it. That is indicative of a crisis, despite massive opposition from various parts of American society. They dismantle the Department, and they use the power of the purse to do that. They use the power of the purse also to go after law firms that they deem as dissidents in preventing the unfolding of authoritarian institutionalism and authoritarian constitutionalism, of opposing the efforts of the executive branch to obviate pluralism in America. So the executive branch is using its considerable power to weaken pluralism in America. The fact this has created, and I'll give you some statistics. This is just a report that has just come out about the rise of far right-wing neo-Nazis, in other words, throughout America. A sharp rise in the last 6 months, but also even before that, under Biden. When the government goes after pluralism, it encourages authoritarian elements. It encourages fringe elements of the right wing to become the norm, to become the mainstream. And one of the reasons that January 6, 2021 happened with a wink and a nod of the White House, of some Republicans at least, is precisely that is the attack on Congress by a mob, is precisely because of the slippery slope of authoritarianism, and this emboldened the far right wing. Now, when Trump came to office in the second term, January 20th, 2025, one of the first things he did is he pardoned 1,500 people who were indicted for January 6, 2021. What kind of message does this send to society? Considering Congress is a sacred institution in a liberal democracy, it should be. And the people attacking it and, of course, confronting police officers, local Chicago, sorry, not Chicago, Washington, D.C. police officers, and the security guards over there, those people were pardoned by the president, none other than by the president. This sends a signal, the green light, to the far right that it's open season. And in fact, they, in social media, those people came out have come out in the last 6 months and have stated that this is our time. So they have been brought in from the fringes into the mainstream. This is very dangerous for a liberal democratic society that presumably operates on law and order. This is not law and order. This is chaos. This is encouraging. Rebel activity, counter-revolutionary activity against the institutional structure. This is another manifestation of the institutional crisis in America, when the government itself, at least the executive branch, and those in the party, or the same party as the executive branch, condone this sort of behavior and attack on one of the sacred institutions of society, namely the Congress. On top of that, on the 10th of July 2025, just a few days ago, the FBI launched an investigation on the former CIA chief John Brennan and former FBI director James Comey, both apparently for their testimony during the 2016 election involving Russia, and apparently manufactured evidence to rig the election in favor of Hillary Clinton and undermine the candidacy of Donald Trump. This is unprecedented as well. When the FBI is not going after the far right fringe groups, not who openly in social media boast about this is our time, we're now in the mainstream, we have a friend in government, this government represents us. When it doesn't go after them, when they're not the target, the main target, but the former CIA director and FBI director are, not that they're not that, by the way, I don't want to be the defender of these people. I'm sure they have skeletons in their closet too. That's not the issue. The issue is that this is revenge politics that undermines the institutional structure. What signal does this send, and what precedent does this set for future presidents? What is this? Is this going to be one party going after the other party's former appointees for the FBI and the CIA, other agencies? This is politics of chaos and destruction. Not resting with that, on 22nd of July, Trump ordered the FBI the Department of Justice to investigate former President Obama for his role in the so-called Russiagate, in the so-called Russian meddling of the 2016 election. Okay, that's another book in itself, at least a book in itself. I was stunned when the president, okay, fine, he ordered this, and let them investigate. Let's see where it goes. In my view, it will go nowhere. But let's see where it does go. Let's see how far they carry it to their own self-destruction. In my view, by the way, this is all going to backfire. But let's see where it goes. That's fine. But to say, for the president to say it's time to go after people, it's time to go after people. What signal does this send when the president of the United States says things like that? That this is the politics of revenge, so that the institutional structure, in other words, is there to serve the personal political ambitions and whims, if you will, of the president, that the process is not to be taken seriously. And tradition is not to be taken seriously. Because, of course, this does obviously, Obama replied that this is all about distracting from the Epstein list on which Trump allegedly is on. Well, that's another matter, the Epstein file. But the idea that the White House goes after directors of FBI, CIA, former president, this is at the core of an institutional crisis, and using the Department of Justice is a crisis in the criminal justice system itself, in my view, because they undermine the institutional structure. This is what scholars talk about, refer to as examples when they talk about authoritarian institutionalism. This is it, this stuff like this. Now, one could argue J. Hoover, who has his origins in the FBI during the Wilson administration, Woodrow Wilson back in the war brought him in to go after left-wingers when Wilson wanted to suppress dissidents. And of course, eventually he became director of the FBI for life, and he kept files on a lot of people, especially presidents. Now, this is now, again, that's the reason I mention is that the FBI is clean. The FBI has a long-standing history of keeping files on people. But to use the FBI and the DOJ, the Department of Justice, in this manner to go after the opposition party, whose goals, by the way, in both defense and economic policy are the same as the Republican Party. If you look at the neoliberal structure and the military Keynesian structure of the United States, both political parties have served neoliberalism and military Keynesianism. That is, the military-industrial complex, as President Eisenhower on his way out the door in 1961 pointed out, they serve the same masters. And to go after them again is indicative of a larger crisis here. And the question is, why is Wall Street allowing this? Why are the people who financed Donald Trump? Now, one of those is Elon Musk, that Donald Trump then took and put out in front to dismantle, at least actually weaken some of the federal agencies, and dish out massive contracts to Silicon Valley to automate some of these with artificial intelligence machines. Well, Elon Musk did turn out, because there was no doubt that he was, even these people were going to clash anyway. But the rest of them lay low. If anything, they are very docile and follow whatever the unitary executive theory calls for, because they derive massive benefits. Just look at the most recent bill in Congress that was passed and signed by the president, namely $4.5 trillion in tax givebacks, a lot of it, not all of it, to the wealthiest 5% of Americans. Remember, 1% has more money than 90% of the population in America. There are 350 million people. 1% of those, more money than 90%. This is one reason that we have Wall Street um, billionaires and multimillionaires keeping quiet. In fact, a number of people, billionaires, meaning people by this, I should say, billionaires and multimillionaires have said they don't want to say anything because they have too much to lose and nothing to gain by saying anything with regard to the unitary executive theory that Trump is pursuing in various venues, of course. The Department of Homeland Security has been very busy as a distraction for the massive transfer of wealth from the working class and the middle class to the richest 5%, especially to the 1%. The Department of Homeland Security and the Immigration of Customs Enforcement, ICE for short, I'll just call it ICE from now on, the letters ICE, ICE, have been weaponized and gone after the undocumented workers, but also documented in the process. They sweep up a lot of people. Initially, it was supposed to be the criminals. Then they find out, as we discover from the Wall Street Journal, of all places, which Trump, by the way, is now suing, we find out from mainstream media, in fact, pro-Trump media, that there weren't enough of these people. There wasn't that many of these people. So the idea was just start arresting everybody. And as many Homeland Security and ICE agents have said, well, we'll just do a sweep, you know. The other thing that's disturbing here, besides this, besides the doing the sweep, is that they make no secret, and this is where the crisis of institutionalism comes in, and this is why scholars insist on calling this authoritarian institutionalism in the United States. They make no secret that they are targeting cities and states that are democratic deliberately. Arguing that the Democrats are the ones who support migrants. Now, since I spent decades teaching history and writing history, including labor history, migrants are workers. That's all they are. They are very low-paid workers. They're the lowest paid workers. They live in horrible conditions, especially illegal migrants. They contribute immensely to the American economy. They provide low-cost labor to businesses, small and large, everything from a small farmer, medium-sized farm, to meat-packing companies, to hotel chains that employ them, to factories. Okay, they're workers. Did they come illegally? Okay, fine. There's a process to be dealt with. Detaining and throwing them in cages and taking their children, and in some cases, as we have found out in congressional testimony in the Senate and the House, some of these people have, like all human beings, they're susceptible to illnesses, including the children. And some of them have serious illnesses, like cancer. And treating them in the manner that they do, okay, like animals, in other words, it leaves a lot to be desired, because it is indeed reminiscent of interwar totalitarian societies. Countries that have gone after migrants, immigrants, ethnic groups, targeting ethnic groups, have been historically far right wing, okay? And they have a stigma in the history of Western civilization. At the very top is the Third Reich under Adolf Hitler. That's at the very top. The question is, does a liberal democratic society have any resemblance to it? Should it have any resemblance to a totalitarian society? And certainly not. But what if it resorts to practices that are not that different? That's where the institutional crisis comes in. The Global Project Against Hate and Extremism is an international organization, and it just recently, I just happened to see it by accident, by the way, I wasn't looking for it, just recently published a report, its 2025 report, and the sharp rise of the far right in the United States from 2020 to 2024. There has been a huge rise in the far right wing, and especially, this goes to 2024, in the last 6 months. In other words, the first 6 months of the Trump administration. Interestingly enough, when you have at the head of the FBI people who are more interested in the former FBI director and the former CIA director and in former President Biden, and in migrants, migrant workers, some hotel cleaning woman, and children, migrant children in school. If you're interested in that aspect of the criminal justice system that has been morphed in such a way so that it serves a political agenda, then the far right, which the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism regards as extremely dangerous, because some of these organizations openly advocate neo-Nazi ideology and neo-Nazi practices and white supremacy. Okay? They don't hide it. They tell you, we're white supremacists. We're here because we feel threatened by migrants. And interestingly enough, in fact, there are a couple of scholarly articles, again, by accident, I happened to see, that deal with this. They actually invoke the plight of the Native Americans, the so-called American Indians, who were taken over by the European colonists, Anglo-Saxon colonists from the 17th century onward, and gradually regimented all the way until the late 19th century, after the Civil War, the so-called westward movement in American history, where they pushed them into Indian reservations, and of course, under horrible conditions, and of course, the white man, under white supremacy, mastered the land that used to belong to the Native Americans. They actually use that example and argue that migrants, given their sheer numbers from the global south, especially Latin America, by the way, predominantly Catholic, something that the Catholic Church, something that the Vatican, which now has an American Pope, by the way, a Pope who is an American, they are outraged about, because they're targeting Catholics from Latin America. Anyway, that's a side issue. The issue here is that they're actually using that argument, saying we're going to wind up like the Native Americans that our forefathers pushed aside, took their land, and put them in reservations. That's how we're going to wind up if we permit migrants, whether from Latin America, Africa, or the Arab world to come in. Now, why are they so afraid? Because when you look at the demographics of America, what you see is by 2050, the majority population in America will not be white. It will actually be Hispanic. Okay? According to demographers, including government statistics, by the way, that's how it's going to be. The so-called minorities of the American society of today, 25 years from now, it may take 30 years. I don't know. It may take 20. But what we see is the configuration of the demographics in America shaping to push the now majority population, the white population, into minority status. In other words, a sort of situation like South Africa during the apartheid era. Okay, they're afraid of that. They're afraid that this, at least in their in their wild mythology and imagination, although 8 years of Obama proved nothing but a black president catering to white elites. Within them, there were a few blacks who were black billionaires and multimillionaires, but it's the white dominated elite controlling the American institutions that Obama served, not blacks. Now, vilifying migrants is a distraction for the policies that the United States is pursuing to create greater poverty, which is around 11 to 12%, depending on whose statistics you figure. Now, there's 350 million people, 12% below poverty. 78% live from paycheck to paycheck. This is not a good picture. When Mamdani gets elected, and he gets elected by the white middle class in New York City, you know the middle class is afraid that they are next. First the workers, then they're next. So they vote the progressive Keynesian politician. They vote Mamdani with his rhetoric about providing low-cost housing, control on rents, raising taxes on the billionaires, and so forth. Why? Fear of the middle class elects an African-born of Indian descent Muslim who will most likely become the next mayor of New York. Now, parenthetically, let me just say this. We have come to the absurdity of the unitary executive theory to this day, that the president of the United States then makes implied threats against Mamdani. There are implied threats about depriving a duly elected mayor of his citizenship, as though to say that the voters of New York City were wrong to vote the way they did. In other words, obviating the will of the voter of New York City. That is not pluralism. That is not open society. That is not democracy. You can call it anyway, anything you want to, but it's anything but those things I mentioned. That's not social justice. I'm not going to characterize it. It speaks for itself. Depriving an American citizen of his citizenship because because the voters of New York, they had choices. They could have voted Andrew Cuomo. They didn't. They voted for this person. And it was white middle class the way. It would not so much the blacks at all, by the way. They actually veered toward Cuomo. A lot of them stayed home. And only a small segment of Hispanics, Asians, yes, because he's Asian, by the way. So you have this implied threat. Maybe we should just take away his, and then threatening him in all sorts of ways. And who is behind all of this? Who is behind the president and all this? Wall Street and the mainstream media. This herein rests the crisis of American authoritarian institutionalism. This is what it's all about. To have the mainstream media, Wall Street, that's as mainstream economic institution as you're going to get, and the White House making threats about a duly elected mayor in the primary, by the way. Now, I'm going to talk about the last thing I'm going to talk, because I don't want to go more than an hour on this, is what happened out in Los Angeles in June. President Trump knows, the White House knows, that in percentage terms there are as many undocumented migrants out in California as there are about. I looked up the statistics in Texas. However, Texas is a Republican state. He didn't target Texas. He went out to California. And now they're open about it, by the way. Yes, we're going after the Democratic states. We're going after Democratic cities. Now they're open about it. They're not hiding it. Fine. Except that they deployed the National Guard and the Marines. And the question is, and this is again in congressional testimony, senators and House members asked this simple question. Some of them, by the way, former Marines themselves. Is the role of the Marines to do this sort of thing? Crowd control out in Los Angeles without the governor of California's consent, by the way. The Governor Newsom, was not consulted. The mayor of Los Angeles, the mayor of Los Angeles was not consulted. They just imposed the Marine. This is another manifestation of an institutional crisis. When the governor and the mayor of the city of Los Angeles, this is out in Los Angeles County, are not asking you to do this, and that means that the federal government is imposing its will, and it's looking for a military state solution to a crisis that's local, and it is in the hands of local authorities. Not to mention the issue of states' rights here, by the way. Historically important in American history. May not be in France, but it is in the United States, states' rights issue. So what we have is the use of the military, militarizing the police state structure, using the pretext of migrants. As though they were yanking people out of hospitals, out of schools, out of workplaces, whose only crime was, and it's true, this is not to defend anything illegal. The fact is that they did not have the documents. However, there's a process. You do not, the Marines were created for foreign enemies, not for citizens. By the way, the founding fathers were also concerned about that issue as well. That issue is also important. Is it the role of the armed forces of the United States to be used against the civilians? That has the awful odor of authoritarianism. And that's what concerned a lot of people. Now, I want to end it by telling you about some public opinion polls regarding the institutional crisis in America. I looked at one of the companies that I like that keeps statistics is the Pew Research Center, one of my favorites. But there are others very credible, by the way. A lot of them are credible. They are not very good when it comes to to public confidence in in American institutions. We are at a low point since 1979. 1979, President Jimmy Carter was president. 1979 was the post-Vietnam malaise. There was the oil crisis from the Middle East, the OPEC problems with the Middle East. 1979 was the year of the Iranian Revolution when the Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Tehran. It was the year of the Nicaraguan Revolution. The U.S. was in a state of, oh my God, the world, we're losing grip on the world. And of course ourselves. The post-Vietnam bills came due. So public confidence has never been lower in America since 1979. Among the lowest that the public trusts are big business, the media, and yes, the criminal justice system, which is geared, it's politicized, it's geared to target the working class and minorities, by the way. When you look at the prisoner makeup in American prisons, it's working class and minorities. Not to mention that the United States in per capita terms has the largest prisoner population in the world. That is not a good thing, by the way. That is a manifestation of a country that relies on punitive measures rather than reforms and rehabilitation and addressing structural problems, as Cesare Beccaria, the great philosopher, Italian philosopher of the Enlightenment era, pointed out, to prevent the working class and those who are marginalized from resorting to crime. Okay? In other words, the Jean Valjean, the Victor Hugo theory of if your children are starving, you're starving your wife, you're going to steal a loaf of bread. The Jean Valjean theory. So this is not a good thing. This is indicative of a society that prefers punitive. And guess what? In the new budget, massive amounts of money for prisoners, many of which are corporate prisoners. The United States has one of the largest private sector prison system in the world, by the way. So that is a manifestation of the neoliberal crisis as well. Neoliberals are the ones who are interested in privatizing everything. Everything public must be privatized. If they could, they would wipe out the state. There would be no state. They would give it to the private sector. As though humanity, in its wisdom of the last 5,000 years, has been all wrong. That, there's no need for a state. No, not at all. Let's do away with it and hand over business the control of the state, which is exactly what has happened under the neoliberal system. And it's exactly why we have authoritarian constitutionalism and authoritarian institutionalism. Because when you have a businessman president who is catering, whose policies are catering to the richest 5%, I won't say the 1% who own 90% again of the wealth in America, but 5%. That is not just an issue of the cult of personality of this one man. It's not Trump. Trump is the symptom, not the cause. Trump is the symptom of a larger institutional problem. The public opinion polls indicate that a good percentage of people, in fact, 52% maintain that the current president has dictatorial tendencies. 41% point out that there is a problem in America with authoritarianism. So the American public is well aware there's a problem. There's a reason why New Yorkers, white middle-class New Yorkers, went to the polls in the primaries and voted Mamdani, not Cuomo, linked to Wall Street and to the Republicans, by the way. And the reason is because there is an institutional problem. It isn't just one person. Trump is not the problem. Trump. If it weren't Trump, it would be somebody else like Trump. Perhaps much worse for as far as some Democrats. Some Democrats think Trump is the worst thing. He's not. There are actually others who could be much worse. And besides, that's not the problem. The problem are the Democrats actually, and as far as public opinion polls, since I mentioned about, indicate that the American people, the American voters, have lost confidence in the Democratic Party as well. They don't see them providing constructive solutions for a systemic alternative to the GOP that Trump is at the head of right now. Okay, so it's not that they're offering anything. When you have a document recently by the, let me mention this, I wasn't planning to, but a document recently published by the Democratic establishment, I believe it's called Project 2029, to be a counterpart to Project 2025 that the Republican right wing advanced during 24 election. And when you look at who the people behind this are, this document, it's the same old solutions of the Clinton, Obama group, Biden group, the military-industrial complex, Wall Street, sideline the progressives, from Bernie Sanders to this young man in New York City, Mamdani, sideline the progressives, keep going with strengthening big capital and pursue military solutions where diplomatic crises arise. Okay, that's why the Democrats, in my view, bear as much, if not more, responsibility than the Republicans and Trump, because they're not offering a real solution. That's why people stayed home and Trump won. I want to thank you for tuning in. I want to thank you for listening. I want to invite you to write questions, write comments, and by all means, please follow this channel, sign up, and thank you very much again.